Okay, let's get going. In a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce Oumar Doumbouya, who's Director for the European Parliament External Liaison Offices, hot off the Eurostar. Very nice to see you, Oumar. But first, let me welcome Susanne Oberhauser, who will be Head of the European Parliament Liaison Office here in the UK, and the regular face up behind the microphone. Susanne, welcome.
Thank you very much, Emma. So you won't hear very much from me this afternoon. Thank you very much all for coming. We're very happy to have you here. We are delighted in this, super election year to have the super election wash up. And I think they have come fast in the last couple of weeks, and some more than we had expected, actually. We are delighted to have Anand Menon from UK in a Changing Europe, and Lisa O'Carroll, senior I think still Brexit or EU relations or whatever, editor in The Guardian, who are joined by our very own European Parliament colleagues, Jaume Duch, Director General for Communication, spokesperson of the European Parliament, and Oumar Doumbouya, who is the Director for our external liaison offices, all our European Parliament presence outside the EU. Oumar will give some introductory remarks now to set the scene, talk about this election year, what we as an office have done in order to mobilize, and also for perspectives for parliamentary relations building. And then we head straight over to the panel and then to the drinks afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Susanna. Oumar Doumbouya, would you like to join us? Welcome, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, last time I was not physically here. I was connected from Brussels during the election night, and at least I was happy to take the floor and tell you what was the feeling in the chamber. I'm happy to see here some former MEPs. I've just seen Sal Tannock just around, and it was my MEP when I was working at that time in the ECR group. I would like to thank Susan to organize this what we have here today, and I would like to also thank all the amazing team of the EPLOs here in London. Most importantly, we have seen a lot of elections all around the world. 2004 has been a mega election here in Europe, in the UK. Also, half of the world population has been called for the ballot to express their view on the future. We have seen Indonesia, India, South Africa with the change, because the ANC been ruling for more than 30 years, but this was something new. And we have to still come in 14 states in Africa who will run for presidential election and legislative election this year. Of course, I'm not forgetting the US election in autumn, which is something that we all are looking at and to see what will be the outcome. I'm very happy to be here in the European Parliament because I think that the Parliament is where we can find a common ground, where common ground is indispensable to progress. One of the recent steps that the Parliament did is to create the DG, whereby I'm today the director. I'm currently serving the DG, and our main task is we assist our members and empower them through the Parliament and global outreach. We are serving as a vehicle to consolidate the European Parliament role for parliamentary and public diplomacy worldwide, promoting parliamentary democracy. As far that we are talking about the European election today, I wouldn't go so far because my colleagues, Jaume, the Director General, and the spokesperson of the Parliament is here. He will talk to you about all different issues that we are now going through the building in Brussels. First, the 2004 parliamentary election was one of the largest voter turnout in its history. Secondly, we have seen the scenario that the extreme were going to take over, which was not the case this time. We still have the overwhelming pro-EU majority in the European Parliament. That being said, there is indeed a rise in extremism across Europe in polarization and division. I believe that we will go through today and have a discussion about this point that probably all of you would like to know where the Parliament will be going by seeing what we see here, that we'll discuss about that later. People often refer to the EU as a dream, and this can be both a compliment and criticisms. I will say that despite its complex system that is not always easy to grab, from outside the Union have become so much more than a dream. It is a reality, my reality, the reality of 450 citizens. Unfortunately, this reality of ours does not include the UK anymore. However, the European Parliament has been and continues to be keen to maintain and build the relationship with the UK. The fact that the European Parliament keeps open its liaison office in the UK after Brexit is a strong signal. Furthermore, we have established in 2021 the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, the PPA. Is the main forum for official exchange between the European Parliament and the UK. The PPA consists of 35 members in both sides. And normally, they meet twice a year. Unfortunately, this year, there were no meeting because of the election situation that we've seen in the UK and down in Europe. The PPA has been instrumental in overseeing the implementation of the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreements, and in assuring ongoing collaboration in various policy areas, from climate to citizen rights to foreign policies. Regarding our common response to the US, most notably, this forum helped coordinate our action and make recommendations in support of Ukraine. Regarding our common response to the US Inflation Reduction Act, as well as our cooperation within the framework of European political community. We know Parliament have a central role in democratic scrutiny and overseeing of the EU-UK agreement. To achieve this, it is crucial that the Parliament on both sides of the Channel are well informed of each other's legislative work. We are grateful that many of you are continuously contributing to this work. Thank you again to that. Regarding the election in the UK, probably this is something that we're going to speak soon, but I would like to emphasize about the work that the European Parliament in the UK has been doing. The Parliament office here have greatly contributed to promoting the European election among almost 5 million EU citizens in the UK. The first thing we learned from a survey was run at the beginning of 2023 that EU citizens living in the UK are more interesting and positive about the EU than the general EU population. But they were less likely to vote. Our aim was therefore to reach out to all community, adapting the message and the communication tool as much as possible, and working closely together with the EU27 consulate and embassies and with community organizations. What we learned is that years of building trust with partners pay off, and that's what allowed the EPLO in the UK to have a real multiplier effect. Many are here today, and I'm immensely grateful for your continued support. In this respect, and in over cooperation with the EU delegation was crucial, as we greatly benefited from their work with network around the settlement scheme and the trust they have established. This was instrumental in spreading the word almost among all community as well as the embassies and consulates. We focused a lot on promoting voters registration, which meant starting our community communication campaign earlier, but also working even more closely with all to support each other in our effort to promote democracy engagement. I will just be very short about the UK election because this is something that I'm expecting that during this evening we'll go through. But I will conclude to say that today we are the 10th of July. This is 33 years ago when Boris Yeltsin was inaugurating as the first elected president in Russia. And Yeltsin said, "Our great Russian is rising from his knee. We will definitely turn into a prosperous, democratic, peace-loving, law-abiding, and sovereign state." The world looked on with much hope. Russia was way in its path to democracy and the normalization of relations with the West. And yet, here we are, 33 years later, coordinating our response to support the war effort in Ukraine. From where I stand, promoted parliamentary democracy through a strengthened political and civil society dialogue with our counterparts across the world is a very good start. So I will be very short. Thank you very much for this, and I hope that we'll all have a great discussion tonight. Thank you.
Oumar, thank you very much indeed. And just to let you know, Oumar will be here when we go into the Q&A session. So if you do have any questions for him about what he's just said and indeed to contribute, then think about it. Remember the wine, ladies and gentlemen. Just to let you know also, I thought it only polite to let you know that this session here at the moment is being recorded and it will later be placed on YouTube. However, that is just going to be the panel discussion. Once the Q&A starts, we turn the cameras off. And so you may feel a little bit more, well, I don't know how you might feel, but that's something to think about. I'm going to bring on my panelists now. I'm delighted to invite Jaume Duch, who's from the European Parliament, up to the stage. Anand Menon, who's Director of UK in A Changing Europe, and Lisa O'Carroll, who I have you senior correspondent for Brexit and EU topics for The Guardian, but we don't know. Just tell us what you do. Welcome up to the panel. A warm round of applause for the panelists, please. Thank you. Sit where you like. Make yourselves comfortable. I think it would be interesting and indeed useful if we all turn our attention to that. Jaume, could you explain to us just a little bit about, if we look at the top left, that's a hemicycle from just before the 9th of June. Then we have what has happened since. Can you point out the big changes for us?
Yes, first of all, you will see that there are several changes, but I wouldn't say it, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted. On the question, if you compare these two hemicycles, what in our, let's say, jargon we call the camembert, because it's a kind of camembert cheese, you will see that there are several differences, but not as many differences as, let's say, media announced during several weeks before the day of the elections. The biggest political group is still the EPP, and by the way, so the Christian Democrats moderates, let's say, by the way, with around 12 more seats, I think. Then second is, as it was the case since 1999, the Socialists and Democrats. They've lost a couple of seats, but not too many, 3, I think. And then, there is a change, for example, in which of these political groups is the third one, which, by the way, is a new group, which didn't exist previously, which is this Patriots for Europe, 84 seats, which in some way is the previous or the former ID, but with the addition of Viktor Orban, so the Hungarian government party, and also the extreme right party in Spain, Vox. But of course, the figures are different. You see that they move from 42 to 84 because in some way they've been, let's say, more successful in attracting people that in the last legislature were non-attached, were attached to none of these political groups. But maybe what is important here is where are the majorities or where there are no majorities anymore. The traditional pro-European majority, EPP, Socialists or Social Democrats, Liberals, has lost a couple of seats, but I wouldn't say no more than 12, which in a parliament of 720, it's not enormous. They still represent 55% of the members of the House, so this is a majority, short majority, but a majority that should work, but in many cases will, of course, need to be reinforced from the left with the Greens, or from the right, maybe, with at least parts of the ECR political group, which is the group where you can find, for example, the Polish PIS, so the party of Mr. Kaczynski, and of course, Fratelli d'Italia, the party from President of the Italian government, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So, there is a little bit more of extreme right. There is slightly a little bit more of extreme left. But as President Metsola said the night of the elections, center holds.
Thank you for that. Lisa, you were in Brussels that night. What we've just heard Jaume is saying is that the centre holds, the majority, we have the socialists and we have the EPP who are pretty holding strong for this one. But there was a real sense that night that there was a shift, that there were two things that were happening. First of all, Renew Europe, Macron's party, lost votes, and that triggered what we all know what happened next. But also you had this shift to the right and this regrouping, also that we saw that in France as well. What was it like when you in the room when it was all happening?
I think it was remarkable. Everybody was expecting the EPP to hold. We thought that Renew would be squeezed by the right and the left. The Greens, the drop in the Greens was a bit of, not so much a shock because the Green Deal had come under attack. Environmental climate change issues have been instrumentalised by the right, but there was an absolute sense of shock. AfD came second in Germany. So on that night, I was in the, as you were, in the hemicycle, which was converted into a super slick press centre. It was amazing. Congratulations. We were all impressed. But I went down to the EPP headquarters that night, where they were waiting for Ursula von der Leyen in her sort of carnation as a candidate to become the president of the Commission for a second term. And it was really, really jolly. It was 5 more years, 5 more years, 5 more years as they brought her in a very sort of un-Ursula von der Leyen sort of style. And afterwards, I went and spoke to Manfred Weber, the head of the parliamentary EPP. And I said, congratulations, but this is a dark night. AfD have done really well. Le Pen has done really well. And he said exactly what you said, which is we're the stabilising force. We are this more or less a civilising force. And I personally think that's very dangerous, that you have to call out the far right. There are some very serious extreme right parties represented in the European Parliament. And we can't just go around and call them, people even have difficulty calling them far right, extreme right. Journalists have lengthy discussions in newspapers, and I'm sure in the BBC as well, about what you call these groups. So I think there's a danger in that they become, the right becomes normalised, and the normalised, the central becomes right, and you don't have that distinguishing feature. And I think that's a dangerous element that I saw on that night.
Anand, we'll talk an awful lot more about the United Kingdom's relationship with Europe, but in a moment, which is your major area of expertise. But let's just look a little bit about this and this shift, perhaps not numerically away from the centre right and centre left, but from where the alliances are now going to be formed. So if you look at the EPP, it's sort of comfortable position for so long has been with the socialists. Mm-hmm. But given what Lisa is talking about now, the fact that there is this sort of call from the far right, do we feel that actually the parliament as a whole, and we're probably talking about specifically about the EPP, will be drawn further and further to the right?
I think I'd say two things. I mean, the one thing that those sort of diagrams don't tell you is that the EPP of 2024 is not the EPP of 2019. I mean, one of the reasons the EPP managed to hold on to as many seats as it did was by cuddling up to the far right. And you can see that drift in the 6 months before the elections, whether it's on the environment or whether it's on immigration. The EPP drifted rightwards. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when pondering what the parliament will be like, because I think on things like green things, and insofar as the parliament is involved on things on immigration, the EPP will find it easier, given the position it fought this election from, to look right than to look left. I think there's all sorts of dangers, and I think the history of Western Europe tells us that the one way you don't deal with the far right is to accommodate them. I think they're making a very, very profound mistake here, but that's what's happening. I mean, the other general point I'd make about the ideological direction of the European Union is that, I mean, ironically, and I don't want to make this conversation all about us, the ideological shifts implied by the European Parliament elections are as nothing compared to the ideological shift we've seen since we left, during which time the European Union has become less liberal, less open. The political economy of the European Union has been utterly transformed. It's partly because of the absence of Britain around the Council table and around the European Parliament table. It's partly because of COVID and the war in Ukraine. But actually, hidden behind numbers that might reassuringly look a bit similar to last time, the European Union in political economy terms is an absolutely and utterly different beast to that which it was. I remember I did a talk about 3 months ago to a bunch of senior Dutch civil servants who were here in London. And I said, as a joke, God, it's amazing. We turn our backs for 6 years and you people let the French take over. And they all just nodded rather glumly and said, yeah, that's what's happened. And I think, that goes above and beyond elections. But behind that, there has been a shift of the political economy of the European Union that is really quite remarkable.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the French taking over. The biggest party now, the national delegation, the largest national delegation, is the National Rally, France's National Rally. It has 30 EU lawmakers, and it has Jordan Bardella at the helm. So are we expecting, regardless of the size of the representation, the noise will be different? Who wants to take that one?
I don't know. I mean, if you look to this, of course, I understand that political parties can, let's say, move from ideological point of view, and this is something that happens not just in the European Parliament, but also in many national parliaments, because both are connected. But if you look to these figures, you will see that in reality, nothing can really happen if there is no agreement between at least 3 political groups. And you know that if the EPP tries to, let's say, to organize majorities using its right side, there is not too much space, because there will be a cordon sanitaire which will take the whole Patriots for Europe, and also those members who are at the right side of the Patriots of Europe, who probably will join a new political group, which again will be included in this cordon sanitaire. So in reality, if the EPP tries to organize, let's say, a legislative coalition with both ECR and Renew, first of all, I don't think that Renew will accept in most cases, but even if they accept, this is not a numerical majority. So in reality, the EPP will need the socialists in the same way that the socialists will need the EPP. So it's going to be a parliament where in reality, the negotiation will go on every day.
I will ask you later if anything is ever going to get done, given what you've just said. What you have mentioned, though, is you've introduced the Patriots of Europe, who, 3-4 days ago, didn't even exist. And there is this new party with the National Rally, Fidesz from Hungary. We've got La Liga, Vox in Spain, Chega in Portugal. We've got the Czech Republic. We've got more Czech Republic parties. Lisa, Jaume just mentioned the idea of them all agreeing. How likely is it that they will agree now that they've come under one umbrella of Patriots of Europe?
Well, it was interesting, as you said, it's ID by another name with Fidesz, with Orban's group, and you've talked about the cordon sanitaire. I'm a bit confused by that myself, as I understood it, that those far-right parties don't get any positions on committees, but they've got, according to Politico yesterday, they've got 2 committees.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. So that goes to a vote, doesn't it, next week? So we'll see the test of how that cordon sanitaire holds.
Does anyone here need explanation what a cordon sanitaire is, or we all know what it is? Is anyone saying yes? Friend. Someone explain what the cordon sanitaire is. It's just a kind of like
they just agree among themselves not to work with the far right. And it exists in Dutch politics as well. And sorry, in Belgian politics, there's a cordon sanitaire not working with the far right.
Questions will be asked, given the fact that this is quite a loud group. Questions will be asked about how democratic that is.
I have asked a academic about that, and his answer was, and I thought it was quite good, was actually if the majority are, if the centre are in the majority it's the majority that rules. It's not the minority that rules, whatever hue their politics is.
Let's talk a little bit about the ideology behind groups like this. We've had Jordan Bardella saying, as patriotic forces, we are going to work together in order to retake our institutions and reorient policies to serve our nations and peoples. How do they do that then?
I mean, I think the saving grace about the nationalist right is that they find it hard to work with foreigners.
And each other.
And that,
each other.
But precisely, by which I mean each other, which is that, their agendas automatically clash because of the natures of the party they are. And that's a sort of inbuilt trick that was invented in the European Parliament to sort of ensure that it was pro-European groups that would ultimately run the Parliament, because it's only really pro-European groups that are keen on collaborating across Europe. So there's a sort of inbuilt mechanism there. I always have thought that when it comes to the far right, the real importance of European elections is not so much how much influence they can bring to bear within the European Parliament, but is the degree to which their success in European Parliament elections feeds their success at home. And what do you get from European Parliament? And you can see that actually, I think Reform will really struggle here. Why? Because European Parliament elections are second-order elections where people vote for dodgy parties far more readily, which raises their profile. Because you get coverage and you get airspace from being in European elections. And crucially, you could think back to UKIP about this, you get a load of cash. You get a whole load of money that can be used to organise yourself nationally. So actually, part of me thinks you don't breathe a sigh of relief and say the centre holds till all the countries where the right have done very well have had national elections. Because it's only at that point you know that there hasn't been that spillover effect that quite often you have between what goes on in European Parliament election and what goes on nationally. And I'll reiterate the point I made about the EPP earlier on. It's not simply enough to say the far right haven't won because their parties haven't won elections. UKIP never won an election, and we seem to have left the European Union. Right? So it is partly about whether or not the agenda of these parties makes it into the mainstream. And that, I think, is something we should watch quite closely as Dutch politics unfolds, as French politics unfolds, and as German politics unfolds over the next 2 or 3 years.
One thing that you mentioned, Jaume, was the addition of the other parties now. And we have, in addition to Patriots for Europe, which the new-ish kids on the block, we even have even more new kids, or the potential mention in the last 48 hours that there could be another far-right group, which will be vehemently opposed to the Green Deal, vehemently opposed to further European integration. And as Anand says, everybody can agree on what the problems are, but no one can quite agree on what the solutions should be. But when you suddenly have to start to have a very busy hemicycle, and you start to add more slices into the camembert, how does that change the dynamic of the parliament as a whole?
I mean, it's a parliament. So at the end of the day, in parliaments, what is important is where are the majorities and where are the minorities. In my opinion, if there is at some point an influence of what happens in several member states, several, not all of them, because again, if you look to the result of the European elections, of course, there was an increase of the extreme right in France, very visible. By the way, third time in a row that they won the European elections, so it was not a kind of surprise. It happened already in 2014, and it happened in 2019. Meloni, but okay, Meloni won the elections 2 years ago in Italy. But then you see that...
But she won as an incumbent.
Yeah, but when you compare, for example, the result of many of these extreme right parties with the national elections or with the last European election, you see that this is not exactly a pan-European trend. It goes country by country. For example, in Spain and in Portugal, the two extreme right parties, Vox and Chega, got a better result than in the last European elections, but a worse result than in the last national elections. So there was a decrease of these parties compared with these same parties in the national elections. And more interesting even, in the Scandinavian countries, in those countries where the extreme right was close to the government or in the government, they also reduced their presence now in the European Parliament. So yeah, there are countries where are, let's say, following one trend and parties following another one. In this case, of course, the question is, and I think you are right, is how good they will be in cooperating among themselves. Until now, this was almost impossible because these parties tend also to be very nationalistic. And of course, I mean, at some point they clash because it's in their ideology. So until now, this cooperation was really very, very, very inefficient. I would say no more than technical, nothing about politics. Now you see, and this is also a little bit the difference, that there are at least two of, I mean, this Patriots for Europe political group, it's a group where there are a couple of parties which are already in the government, and then maybe this will change also, let's say, the necessity for these members to work in the parliament because their colleagues in the government will be doing more or less same things at the level of the Council of Ministers, at the other side of the Rue de la Loi. This is maybe a little bit of change. And then, and this is the last element that I would like to mention on this, is that you see that, and this is maybe positive, maybe negative, open to the discussion, they are more and more accepting the frame. Okay, now when you listen to Viktor Orban or when you listen to some of his colleagues, it's not about Europe yes or Europe not. It's about the kind of Europe that I would like to get and how I'm going to use the European Parliament to try to change policies. And they discuss about these policies. They don't discuss about the existence or the non-existence of the European Union, which was in some way let's say the proposal that came from this party some years ago. So we'll see. Yeah, it's going to be quite an intensive legislature for sure. But I wouldn't say so pessimistic.
No, and just we have quite a few members of the sort of London's diplomatic presence here in the room. Thank you so much for your time this evening. At least I was just wondering what Jaume was saying there about the influence up to the European Parliament and then back down to local governments. I wonder whether something like what happened in the European Parliament on the 9th of June, suddenly everybody realized how relevant Europe was. I mean, it was relevant enough for Macron to dissolve his parliament. But when you have a look at, we have Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Italy and Croatia. We have the far-right governing coalitions there. We have polls in September, where it's likely that the Austrian far-right will do very, very well. Portugal and Slovakia in particular, we have movements there. Are people, when they talk to you, saying, it's because of what's happening in Europe that the far right is getting a toehold, or is it the other way around?
No, I don't. I don't recognise a country, and I'm Irish, so Ireland is still part of the EU, where people are that familiar with what happens in Brussels. I think it's a general interest in it and general knowledge. I think in the voting percentages, you saw France was quite high, but smaller countries like Croatia, Latvia, was quite low. I mean, the AfD are, I remember one German journalist saying to me that they're more like a separatist group with a voter base in Eastern Europe, and, they need more scrutiny. There's a general, I mean, you could say that there is, I think, a disconnect that we saw in Brexit between the politics at the centre and what voters think about politicians representing their interests, and largely that generally comes down at voting day to what's in your pocket. And I think you could argue that there has been a failure of the state of politics, which has allowed a space for the far right to grab issues that the public have grievances over, which, in relation to cost of living, could go back to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you don't hear that in the narrative. Migration is a very, very difficult thing, and I think the UK have benefited from the migration discussion, and the UK has benefited from the fact that migration after Ukraine was until Israel probably the second most difficult subject at the European level, and that possibly has come from the countries up to Brussels rather than the other way around. And certainly, for example, with the EPP, and just to go back to parliamentary groups going to the right, their manifesto, which came out just after the Migration Pact had been signed off after many, many years of difficulty, the EPP's manifesto went way further, kind of the brainchild of Tajani in Italy. And then you had 10 countries separately calling on maybe a month later, calling on Brussels to go even further than the Migration Pact, as if that was even possible. So it's a mix of things. I haven't answered that very well, but
I think
there's some thoughts.
I think you did. Thank you for that. You mentioned the B word. We do need to talk about the United Kingdom and its relationship with the European Union. I think, Anand, you and I were discussing this before we came on the stage, that the names of the big Brexit beasts are off the stage. Rees-Mogg's gone. Johnson's gone. Gove's gone. It's a huge clear-out. What are your thoughts?
I mean, you sort of forget in between elections just what a sort of elective dictatorship we are, and just how profound and all-consuming a change of government is. Because you can watch, whoever it is from the Tory right moaning about whatever it is they're moaning about, and just think, who cares? In policy terms, the pressure on the government is going to come from completely different places. One of the things we will see over the next few years are businesses being far more outspoken about the costs that Brexit is imposing on them than they were under the Conservative Party. If you think back to the Conservative Party over the last 7-8 years, You can start in 2015 with John Redwood telling businesses that openly back Remain that they would be punished. You have all sorts of stories straight after the referendum of Tory special advisors saying to business leaders, if you raise Brexit, they'll throw you out of the room. If you complain about Brexit, they won't talk to you. You had Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary saying, F business. Businesses were cowed into submission under the Conservatives and did not feel able to speak about their concerns. That's changing. You can see that changing now. You see the British Chamber of Commerce 2 or 3 weeks ago was saying, actually, we need a closer train. So that's the first pressure. The second pressure is the Labour electorate is overwhelmingly pro-Remain. I did a piece on our website, I can't remember the numbers, which is why I'm saying this, which has the numbers. But the numbers of Labour voters, the proportion that are pro-rejoin, that are pro-having a referendum in the next 5 years are very high. So the Labour electorate is pro-EU. And the Labour Party is massively pro-EU. I mean, Labour conference is going to be a pain for Keir Starmer because every year, perhaps with the exception of this year, which will be a drunken celebration, but every subsequent year is going to be a parade of pro-Europeans saying, why are you being so cautious on Europe? So all the headwind is going to come from the opposite side of the political spectrum. And that's going to have really profound consequences for the nature of the debate and for the way, a Labour Party that has defined its Brexit policy because they're scared of the Tories on Brexit is going to have a Brexit policy now that is vulnerable to pressure from exactly the upper side.
Or arguably, it no longer needs to be scared.
Well, I mean, that depends. I mean, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what they think deep down. My sense about the Labour leadership, and I can talk about the manifesto, because I think some of the stuff they said about Europe in the manifesto is a bit silly, to be perfectly honest. But I don't get the impression that either Starmer or Rachel Reeves, and it's those two that will run this government, are massively, they're not pro-European in a Tony Blair kind of way. And I think they want economic results far quicker than long drawn out negotiations with the European Union about big stuff would allow. So I'm not convinced. I'm not one of those people that thinks as soon as they've won, they'll do a volte face. Don't get me wrong. I think next Thursday, we will all sit there open-mouthed in amazement at the utter change of tone that we hear. Because all of a sudden, we have a British government that wants to be friends with its European partners, that wants to work closely with them, that wants to lead in Europe, they say in their manifesto, and that will want Europe to succeed. The era when we used to crow about things going badly in Europe is gone. We are now going to be partners in a way that we haven't been, arguably since Tony Blair, actually. But in substantive terms, I'm not convinced that much is going to change anytime soon.
Lisa, do you agree with that? Because I think you said a few days ago that what's happened now is what's called a clean break approach. I think you said that clean break from the Tories rather than from the EU. But we have seen a much more international approach. I mean, David Lammy wearing out his shoe leather and rocking up the air miles within 72 hours of Labour getting in was clearly an enormous sign that doors are open and re-engagement is the order of the day.
And if the Tories had done that, I was thinking that would be called cherry picking. Oh, they're off trying to pick off France or, the Netherlands, the UK-friendly countries. I think absolutely I agree with the attitude. I have written a piece a few weeks ago saying, the EU won't be rushing back to open Brexit negotiations, but they will definitely be embracing UK. And one thing I think that has made that much more possible now, in a way, paradoxically, is because Macron has been wounded. And that the UK now looks like, with a centre-left government, looks like that strong and stable, to coin a phrase, country.
Please don't say that.
that Theresa May dreamed of. But, they're there for 5 years. They've got a massive majority. Scholz is facing the electorate next year. Macron could call, he can't call another election for a year, but, what type of government is he going to be able to form? What kind of prime minister is he going to be able to appoint? Will it be a technocrat? So I think the UK is looking strong. And, with Ukraine, with Russia, the EU will definitely want a close relationship with the UK. But what that looks like and how deep that will go into Brexit remains to be seen. And I suspect, as somebody said, it'll be wide and shallow.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because whatever the opinion is from this side of the channel, who wants to answer this? How much does the EU really need the United Kingdom, apart from issues of security? But also, Is there any appetite from Brussels to start reworking, reapproaching, reassessing? Jaume, maybe you want to begin with that.
I would say not yet. First of all, I think that there was a particular relief about the result of the British elections in Brussels. It was very clear. First in a row, second was France. But at the same time, the mood in Brussels is wait and see. If you have a look to, let's say, to the top list of priorities that the European Union has in front of it in the next years, trying to reverse Brexit is not one of them, or at least not yet. Why? Because, again, now, in some way, the ball is in your court. It's not in the court of Brussels. Brexit was quite a very tough, difficult divorce. The way that Brexit was organized by the British was really harming quite a lot the relationship between both sides. So now it's logic that you don't expect from Brussels immediate signs of let's try to do this, let's try to do that. I think that now it's more this kind of waiting mood. Okay, let's see now what are the next or the first moves coming from the British government. Of course, we are neighbors. Of course, we have to be friends. Why we weren't friends during these last years? This was not normal. This was a political choice that nobody understood in Brussels. And then, of course, there are many things that could be done in the next years. You mentioned security and defense, and of course, this could be a priority because of Ukraine. And by the way, the European Union, when Brexit was discussed and negotiated, the European Union was in favor of having a very clear and close agreement with the British on defense and security. And again, this was rejected. It was refused by the British government. Why not to start again discussing about cooperation, for example, on educational policy, on science, technology, research, all those things that are not really very, very political, but come with advantages for citizens. Why the British students are out of the Erasmus scheme? This was a stupid decision, sorry. These are the things that, in my opinion, in the next 2, 3, 4 years could in some way pave the way for a more, let's say, in-depth discussion about the future of our relationship.
That's a very gentle, softly approach. Anand, you're keen to jump in. What do you think? How much does the EU care about us?
Partly to play devil's advocate, but partly because I think that's a bit bonkers. If you listen to the rhetoric we'll hear in Washington tonight, okay, which will be about shared security challenges, about the world being as dangerous as it's ever been, about us being entwined in terms of our vital interests and unable to address those challenges without cooperating together. And then you hear this language about, well, the ball's in your court, rules, we've got to be, we're happy to talk about security unless it involves the market, in which case you can get lost because you're not in the single market. I just think there is a massive dissonance between geopolitical reality and a very, very defensive approach to the United Kingdom, which just don't add up, because the most important issues we face today are not whether or not it would undermine the single market if the UK was in Galileo. It is, what if Trump wins? What if Putin invades a European country? And what if China invades Taiwan? And I don't think it should be a matter of debate which are the more important set of issues. And if you buy the argument, which I do, that actually for any major security challenge, excluding the UK from European initiatives is an act of self-harm, given the UK's relative, though declining, heft, then actually we need to find a way of getting beyond the theology to ensure that that relationship works in all respects. And I just worry that both sides are going to tiptoe a little bit around this for fear of not offending either domestic constituencies or each other. And I sort of think, ultimately, the United States is not going to take responsibility for European defense. It might not be under Trump, it might be in 10, 15 years' time. The direction of travel is absolutely obvious.
If you talk a little bit more, though, about the appetite from the United Kingdom, yes, we had Labour voted in. Some might say because the Tories failed rather than Labour won, if that can be put in that position. But also, we've seen the rise of reform, and we have seen the groups which bang the drum for Brexit louder than anybody, and they are now in Parliament, and they represent a big chunk of the electorate here.
Well, I mean, the first thing is, to an extent, you're right. And to an extent, I buy this fragile majority story, that there are all sorts of caveats to that. I mean, the first thing I would say is, if I beat you at tennis, I don't care if it's because your racket broke or you twisted your ankle, I won, right? And that's true in spades of British politics. It really doesn't matter. Labour have a whopping great majority. They can do whatever they want for the next 5 years. So I don't think, and actually, a government, especially a government with a big majority, should be able to shape public opinion. So whatever the sort of fissures in the coalition or the dangers from left or right, you've got 5 years with absolute power to do something about what people think. So I think I would sort of handle that cautiously. Yes, Reform did well. One of the interesting questions about Reform for me is Reform, if you didn't know, isn't a proper political party. It is a limited company, and Nigel Farage owns most of the shares. He's done that on purpose because, Nigel has many attributes, but one of them is not management. All right? He doesn't like management. He doesn't like organisations. He doesn't like other people having a say. So we've got this party structure. That's fine for a party with 5 MPs. It's not fine for a party that aspires to have 50. So one of the big challenges, I think, for Reform going forward is not political, it's organisational. And I do wonder, actually, whether they'll manage to make that leap from this rather odd creature. And actually, on the left, where there is an equal challenge, you've had all those independents, you had the success of the Greens, and the Greens are second now, I think, in about 50-something seats, if I remember. Thank you very much. I'm rubbish with numbers. It's worked so far for the Greens, despite the fact that they're this weird hodgepodge of essentially, I caricature, so don't quote me on this, NIMBY conservatives and massively radical pro-Palestinians who somehow coexist in the same party because no one's subjected them to scrutiny and they're a protest party. So I think, yes, the Labour majority is very wide and very shallow. Yes, it is absolutely true that the UK electorate is more volatile than it's ever been, and it is conceivable that a majority of 170 can be overturned at an election, though a lot will hinge on what the Conservatives do. But we shouldn't take it as ordained that these challenger parties are going to be effective in this Parliament.
Thank you for that. Lisa, I know you're keen to speak. I mean, your view on who really wants who the more and whether there's an appetite on either side to get back together.
Well, I wrote down 2 things, NATO and Erasmus, because they point to 2 things. One is the school of thought in Brussels, which thinks, well, do we need a security and defence, anything deep with the UK? It was notable, I think, that David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, said that they were looking for a declaration. So declaration could mean anything. It could be a political declaration with little below it. We were also here on a deeper level in relation to security and defence. Yes, it was on offer before and Theresa May rejected it. And that was considered one of the kind of weakest moments in their negotiation because it was a strong card that she had. And we know that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper went to The Hague last year, I think it was, kind of a show of intention. But one of the questions will be that is troubling lots of countries at the moment is where does all this vast amount of money that's going to be spent on arming Ukraine and creating this new defence industry in Europe, where can it go? And there was a lot of argument in the last year, which I think was only resolved quite recently in the last few months as to whether the money could actually go to foreign countries and like the UK. So that will have a political edge to it. And then the other thing on Erasmus is it is something you hear frequently in Brussels. They desperately want Britain back in Erasmus, but there's a cost to it. And what the Brits have said is that there's a disproportionate cost for the UK because more EU citizens want to come to the UK than UK citizens want to go to Europe. It surely can be fixed. And people say that's low-hanging fruit, that if the Labour Party wanted to do that, they could arrange that, not a huge amount of money, and it would have political traction in countries that maybe, I mean, for instance, there's one Eastern European country, I was at a briefing maybe 4 weeks ago, it was a very significant briefing on a significant subject, and the UK came up and they weren't even aware there was a possibility that Labour were getting in. The UK was just not on their radar at all. So that's why Erasmus might have disproportionately positive impact, but definitely the Labour Party, if they want to have to get what would be seen as concessions from the EU, they have to offer something. And I don't, at the moment, see what that is, either in security, defence, education. They'll have to come up with something that will look good.
Let's move on. Let's go back to the European Parliament and the jobs that it's got for the next few years. The big issues ahead for the EU Parliament are, I mean, I've just made a few notes of migration, climate policy, foreign policy, defence, EU enlargement, economy. Which is the biggest, depends how you frame it, headache or challenge for the Parliament in the next few years? Jaume, should we start with you?
Budget.
I wouldn't say for the Parliament, I would say for the European Union.
Yeah.
And I would maybe mention, first of all, what we call strategic autonomy. So how to transform the European Union in an organization which is able to survive and to still offer advantages to its citizens in a world where Russia has changed enormously, where we don't know what will happen with the United States after the 4th of November, with the role of China, not just on trade. I mean, this multilateral, globalized world of 20 years ago has changed and doesn't exist anymore in the same way, which means that the European Union has, in some way, to become more adult in many things. First, security and defense, for sure, but it's also about access to energy. It's about access to all kind of basic goods. It's also, of course, about its trade policy. It's about competitivity with the United States, but also with the United Kingdom. This is a big package of things to be done in the next 5-10 years. Then, of course, it's about enlargement to the Western Balkans, and enlargement to 3 former Soviet republics. Ukraine, of course, but it's also the case for Georgia and the case for Moldova. And this is also going to be a big chunk and a very difficult one, but from geopolitical reasons, it's a priority and should be done. And it's going to create a third priority already, which is an internal reform of the way of working of the European Union and the way of taking decisions, because everybody knows already now the Council has real difficulties in taking decisions when you need unanimity, not only because of Hungarians with decisions linked to Russia, several countries always with several topics. So this is something that has to be improved in these next years. These, in my opinion, are the 3 biggest topics, but in some way they are touching more or less all the EU policies. And then, of course, kind of, let's say, overall thing is money, the budget. Because if you want to go on with the digitalization of the European economy, if we really try to make compatible all this EU legislation against climate change with the interest and the political consequences of the interest of agriculture and all this primary sector of economy. This means a lot of money. If you want to transform the way the European Union is having access to energy, this also means a lot of money. And there, yeah, we come from let's say, a good and positive example, which has been this kind of federal scheme, this next generation recovery fund, which has helped quite a lot, several member states in a difficult situation. Now the discussion, and I'm sure that this discussion will start first in the European Parliament, will be how to transform this temporary scheme in something maybe more permanent, in a way that, yes, there is funding for all these new priorities, because what is evident is that with the ordinary budget of the European Union, you cannot do almost nothing of all these main priorities.
Well, you're going to be busy.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
For sure.
Lisa, I mean, before we came on stage, you said defence, security is the big thing. I mean, I wonder whether it is actually, yes, we have the likes of Viktor Orban popping over to Moscow and then popping up in Beijing and popping up in Kiev on his peace plan. But is the issue of protection and support for Ukraine something which arguably everybody sort of agrees on, that this is something that isn't a big area of dispute? It's something that the European Union absolutely and the European Parliament stands firm on?
I think with the exception of Hungary, yes.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. I think I said Ukraine rather than security and defence, because the attack on Ukraine is seen as an attack on Europe, and that, if, as we know, if Putin if Putin wins, there's a feeling that he will take more. Moldova will be very vulnerable. The Baltic states are obviously have been on standby since the end of World War II, as they'll say themselves, for hostility, or the end of the Soviet Union, rather, for the Baltic states, but Finland certainly since the 40s and 50s. And I think you very much get a sense of that in Belgium, that, all you have to do is listen to Donald Tusk at the EPP conference in Bucharest, which was where there was a selection process for Ursula von der Leyen. Donald Tusk, unfortunately, made a very significant speech 4 minutes long after him, because the EPP, all the prime ministers, had the stage as part of the conference. And it was so somber. He said, more or less, this is 1938. The post-war peace is gone. And I think that kind of feeling that, the good times after the fall of the Berlin Wall and, the collapse of the Soviet Union is gone. And we're only seeing the beginning of what the consequence of that is. And Ukraine is that. And I think you don't get that feeling here in the UK, simply because that vast expanse of water is, even I know between the UK and Ireland, that vast expanse of water means it seems to be a block on communication.
Sometimes it feels very small, sometimes very big.
Yeah. I mean, the UK, of course, is one of the biggest contributors of defence to Ukraine, along with Germany. There's no question there that the UK is full square behind Ukraine, and Boris Johnson, made several trips to Kiev, which were very welcomed by Zelensky. But it impacts everything, and the budget. People say, I was only there for 13 months, but people say budget negotiations, because it goes back to national parliaments, will take years. And what they're talking about, I thought one of the embassies on the Eastern Bloc said they thought that this question about the enlargement would come in 2027 when the next budget cycle starts. Am I right? It's 2027, isn't it?
Yes.
And, if you look at the cost of bringing Ukraine, not Moldova, but Ukraine is so big economically, and the impact that will have on the single market. And I guess you'll start seeing conversations and narrative building in the next, we're 3 years away. It'll be the reverse of Brexit. It'll be what the impact of Ukraine will have. And there are some people who argue that those arguments are already being played out in Poland, where you have all these disputes over grain and farmers, etc.
Anand, what do you think the big challenge for the European Parliament is going to be for the next few years?
For the European Parliament, the MFF is going to be an absolute nasty bun fight.
But
Because money is so central to, it's so central to so much of the populism in countries like the Netherlands. It's massively politicized now. And you've got the shadow of Ukraine. I personally don't think Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union during the next MFF or anytime soon thereafter, but we continue with the fiction. There's a couple of other things, just from what have been said. Firstly, we're fond of saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an attack on Europe, but we don't mean it, because otherwise we'd be fighting. Sometimes we sort of tie ourselves in knots with our own rhetoric. I think the other thing that just sort of haunts me a little bit is that whilst during the Eurozone crisis, some of the vulnerabilities of the currency to asymmetric shocks were dealt with, all of them weren't. And we seem to be living in a land where we don't worry about the euro because we're not having a crisis at the moment. And actually, one of the things I think the European Union needs to think about is its vulnerability to asymmetric economic shocks. And that's just fallen off the agenda entirely, which is understandable, because actually it is remarkably difficult for political leaders to walk and chew gum simultaneously. They tend to focus on the immediate. But it is something I wish was on the agenda a bit higher than it is.
Thank you for that. I'm keen for us all to get to this, to get to questions, and I know, Anand, you have a hot date with Tom Hanks in about an hour and a half. So you have to go in a minute. But I think we need to talk about next week and Ursula von der Leyen and her possible, probable, what's going to happen in terms of being voted next president of the European Commission. We're assuming yes, are we? I know that you're talking about press conferences.
The vote is on Thursday, the 18th.
Yep.
She's got to make a presentation. Schedule hasn't been nailed down, but it looks like there will be a vote either in the morning or in the afternoon. She obviously has the EPP, has the Socialists, probably, give or take, some horse trading. Now the question is whether she can go to pick off some parties in the ECR. She's been very careful about not saying that she would not work with the ECR. And there are talks with the Greens and then the left still to be had. And you were saying she'll be down, her team will be down in Strasbourg, from Monday. And it's a secret vote, which is...
Exactly. I mean, first of all, it's a secret vote, so we don't know. Second, theoretically, yes, she's going to be elected because the figures are there. But 5 years ago, she was elected by a difference of 9 votes. 9 votes in a parliament of 705 members. This time, I'm sure she cannot just go there and try, because there is just one opportunity. I mean, if she's not elected on July, this means that in 1 month more, the European Council will be obliged to come with a different candidature, not with the same one. So, in my opinion, if she feels that this majority is not there or is not safe, maybe she will be the first to ask for postponing the vote till September, which, by the way, happened already once in the case of José Manuel Barroso. Yeah. I don't think this is going to happen. I think that she will be confident. She is spending the whole week, in the European Parliament premises. She didn't accept, let's say, the invitation to go to the NATO summit in Washington. She's meeting from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. with the political groups, with the national delegations, with individual members, one per one. Okay, I don't know what she's discussing or what she's promising, but what I see is that she's doing a very well-organized, let's say, internal electoral campaign.
I'm so glad you said that, because I'm not entirely sure any of us can cope with another vote on anything, ever. Until maybe November. I'm not quite sure about that one. And your thoughts on Ursula von der Leyen next week? And then
no
we go to... Sorry. No idea.
No idea, because it's going to be very, very close, but because it's a secret vote, I've got no idea.
You haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And of course, it's on the same day as the European Political Community, which is the meeting of maybe 45 European leaders, non-EU and EU leaders, and
here in London,
in Blenheim Palace,
Blenheim.
and she won't be there.
I don't see this being compatible. There is one thing that is interesting is the secret vote. The secret vote could be an advantage for Ursula von der Leyen, and it was an advantage 5 years ago, because 5 years ago she was elected getting votes from the Polish extreme right and from Cinque Stelle in Italy at the same time. But officially, you cannot say this because the vote was secret. So this time could happen more or less the same. I mean, the difference with 5 years ago is the Greens. The Greens are really trying to be part of von der Leyen's majority, which was not the case 5 years ago. If she is successful in making them, joining this coalition, this means more or less 50 more votes, so 450, even if there are a couple of delegations within the Socialists or within the Liberals or even within the EPP, because both the French and the Slovenians said before the European elections, no, we are against von der Leyen. Even with, let's say, these maybe possible reduced numbers, it would be around 420, 430. But then the question is, how do you do that in a way that you are not disturbing your own political party, your own political group? Maybe at the end of the day, we see a kind of program which is a little bit more to the left than 5 years ago because of the necessity of getting the Greens. And then the question is what will happen with ECR, and even more concretely, what will happen with Meloni. But because of the vote is secret, they can do what they want.
But I have to say, this sort of stuff is just grist to the mill to the anti-elite rhetoric of a Marine Le Pen or a Geert Wilders. I mean, it just looks awful.
Why?
Because it's secret, it's non-transparent, no one knows, there's all sorts of dodgy behind-the-scenes horse trading going on. It feeds that narrative that they are doing whatever they can to undermine the people. I mean, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that if I were a populist, I would seize on this.
No, because there will be a 3 hours debate where all the political groups will have the possibility to explain their position, where von der Leyen will be obliged to be very concrete in the different points of her program. And then, yes, being secret or not, it's a question, as usual in the European Parliament, on different national traditions. In the Bundestag, these kind of votes are always secret, and nobody says that this is anti-democratic or this is anti-this or anti-that. So it's more linked, and this is, yes, sometimes the difficulty in the European Union, that you have to organize things in a way that sometimes it's closer to some countries or some country traditions and not to others. But again, you will get a lot of discussion about this vote.
Thank you all for your company. There is, I believe, refreshments and the opportunity to talk a little bit further. But for now, thank you so much for your time.